Well, we're going to talk about my mother, and she has an extremely colorful background. First of all, I want to say that whatever I say can be corrected and further updated by other very intelligent people, but this is the way I understand it at the moment. Mom first came to this world in North America apparently in 1930, but she actually traveled into Canada, and she was 20 years of age, and it was 1930, give or take a year. She entered in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and she was on the steamboat, the St. Louis, which traveled from Hamburg, Germany to Canada in 1930. She arrived there on April 6th. They claimed that her birthplace was Romania. That's not correct. That's the country that she left because the boundaries had changed. But she was born in Hungary, southernmost Hungary, which was part of the Austria-Hungary Empire, which occurred at that part at the turn of the 20th century. She was born in 1909 in the town of Saderlach. That's the German spelling. In Hungarian it's different, and in Romanian it's even different again. But it's in German it's called Saderlach, and it was in a region that was settled by German immigrants. And a little bit of background on that. When the Turks failed to capture Vienna in the 1500s, they were driven out of Hungary. Vienna was on the border between Austria and Hungary. When they were driven out of Hungary after the defeat at Vienna by the Polish cavalry, this is an international event. The southern part of what we know as Hungary at the time was a desolate wasteland. And this had been caused by the fact that the Turks, or the Ottoman Turks, had captured most of southern Hungary and depopulated it. And it stayed depopulated for almost 200 years. That meant that the area that was as rich as Kansas and Nebraska had reverted back into bosque, into wild land, full of swamps. And this was the most fertile place in Europe for growing grain, what some people would refer to as the breadbasket of Europe. But because the Ottomans ran it and they wanted a buffer zone between themselves and the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, they left it unpopulated except for Ottoman soldiers. This was returned to the Austrian Empire with the defeat with the Turks at Vienna, and the Empress decided to settle the vacated land, now recaptured, southern Hungary, with a buffer zone of people that were German and Catholic. And the only place you can find German-speaking Catholics at that time was in Bavaria and Swabia. That's in southern Germany, the highlands of southern Germany. And they speak High German, which is the language of Austria-Hungary. So she invited the people, particularly from the Black Forest region of Swabia, to settle in Lower Hungary, and they would be like homesteaders. If they lived on the land for, let's say, 10 or 20 years and reclaimed it, began farming it, it became their property. So many Swabians, including the Bauer family, made a raft, put it on the Danube River, and floated from Swabia to southern Hungary. It's the same river, the Blue Danube. They got out, staked their property like the Sooners in Oklahoma, and began to farm. They had to clear it first and re-drain the swamps and get all the brush out of the area so they could begin to farm it. So it was hard work. Well, that happened 200-300 years before my mother was born. Her family was known as the Bauers, which is a very common German name. The family spoke High German, as all of their neighbors from the Black Forest, and they did a really good job, and the land was wonderful. My mother said that no one knew how deep the good soil went. It was black at the surface, and if you dug 6 feet in the ground, it was still black soil. So when I was a kid, she kept saying, let's drive around Ohio, see if we can find any black soil. And she found some in western Ohio. She found black soil, and sure enough, it was beautifully producing corn. It was wonderful. So anyway, that's the story of why a German family, ended up in what became Austria and later became Romania and became a part of the Iron Curtain countries after World War II, and the story of what trouble it was to get my older half-brother out of Europe. So that's an introduction. The story goes that my mother was invited over or sponsored, and she had to cross into the United States without papers at Niagara Falls, New York. But she was employed by the parish church of St. Ignatius on the west side of Cleveland. This was a German-speaking parish, which there were a lot of ethnic churches in all of the American cities during the last part of the 19th century because of the great influx of immigrants from Europe. And a lot of reasons for that. One of them is hunger and changes of governments into a socialist system in Europe, and people wanted out, and they wanted employment and an opportunity to grow like they found in America. So St. Ignatius Parish hired my mother, and she worked there for 4 or 6 years as a cook and a housekeeper. Now, they say that there were upwards of 5 German-born priests in St. Ignatius Church, and they are all speaking High German, so they must have had a delightful time speaking and eating Southern German food. All of the things that my mother knew how to make, all of the standard dishes. But then, for some reason or another, it was discovered that Mom didn't have the right papers. And she was, in about 1930, she was sent back to Europe. Unfortunately for her, she was not sent to her home country, she was sent back to Germany because she spoke German. They had no idea that she was not native German, so she was sent back as a single person to a country that she did not know a single person. I think, what a stress. And she had to find a job there to earn her passage back to the United States with no help, no assistance, no relatives, no friends. And she did it, and she came back in 1930 something, and got into the United States going to, I believe, Ellis Island, but we haven't found any records. One of the reasons might be of her name. When she came over in 1930, her name on documents was not Catherine with a K or Catherine with a C, but Ekaterina Pasclovitz. Ekaterina is the way the Romanians would say her birth name. And Pasclovitz was her married name. I don't know the first name of her husband, but he and she would be the parents of Matthew Pasclovitz, who eventually got into this country from Europe in the 1980s, and his wife and their 2 children. So, but in German she would have been Katharina with a K, Bauer, and she got a 4th or 5th grade education. And the story she told about education in a small farming German-speaking community in southern Hungary, very interesting. The town could have never been more than 500 people, maybe more like 200. But they had a little grade school which was associated with the Catholic Church. Everybody was Catholic in her hometown. And by the time she got to the third grade, they already had changed nationalities, and the Serbians had taken over that part of Hungary. So the Serbians sent the teachers, and now suddenly, instead of speaking German in the grade school, they had to speak Serbian. So that was a brand new trick, and when there wasn't anybody listening, they still talked in German. A year later, the Serbians were forced out by what soon became the Romanians, and the Romanians took over the school, and they started to teach in the Romanish language, which is related to Latin. Now, nobody spoke Romanish in this town, and nobody knew how to teach it. So by this time, they had run out of teachers, and so my mother in the fourth grade ended up teaching first through fourth grade in German. The history after that, there wasn't much. Most anybody made it past the fourth grade. It was a miracle in a farming community. They had learned to read, write, and add up to 10 so that they could go out and plant and harvest crops. So that's the story about the very rich farmland in Romania/Hungary and how it produced several crops, interesting crops, beside grain, wheat, and corn. And the corn was only used for feeding livestock, not human consumption. It was grown beside food for cattle and food for human consumptions, regular vegetables, which were always grown on little plots of land next to the house. The major money-making crop would be one of two that we would find a little unusual. The first one was tobacco. They would grow tobacco, and she would proudly tell me how her father, Franz Bauer, grew the finest tobacco. And if you know anything about tobacco, it's the quality of the leaf, how big it is, the construction, and of course eventually when it's dried and smoked, if it's got aromatic characteristics. His tobacco brought the highest price. They had to harvest it by hand, one leaf at a time, and hang it in drying barns. And so that was one cash crop from that farmland. The other one, Mother was sort of apologetic. It was called growing poppies. And when they were little kids, they were the right height to go through with a razor blade and slash the little poppy bulbs. And after a week or two, they would go through with little vials and collect the secretion coming out of the poppy bulb. Now, you all know what that's for. That's a great source of hallucinogenic drugs. That's still grown in Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and especially in Afghanistan, which is the chief crop of Afghanistan. And she hated both the poppies and the tobacco. She said it took a long time to wash your hands, and you couldn't get the stains out of your clothes. This stuff, this tarry substance that came out of both plants, she was very undesirable. She preferred to harvest the crops that fed the animals, which is where they got most of their foodstuff from: pigs, chickens, cows, dairy products, and a few horses. All of this farming was done with horse-drawn plows. There was no mechanization whatsoever. The town had no electricity. Even when she left, they had no electricity. Later on, Matt told me they got a little bit of electricity in the 1930s. That's how backward this community was. So that's a little background on where Mom came from and a little bit about her coming over. When she came over the second time with papers, she worked for a family in Cleveland that was on the rich east side of Cleveland to a German, high German speaking family. They were Jewish, and they were both doctors. And she was hired as a nanny and housekeeper. And she did, because she spoke the same type of German language, she raised their two children. Up until the beginning of World War II, then by that time she was married to my father, but that was what she did when she came back. And because of her closeness to these children, they used to remember her even after World War II. They had, the boy that she raised had moved to Brazil, and he was a very influential and successful businessman in Brazil, a national senator, and a vice president and owner of a steel mill. But he would fly up to Cleveland every year to see his family and friends, and especially to see Mom. And they always were bearers of wonderful gifts, as I remember as a child, especially coming out of World War II, when no kid had any toys. They would be bearers of toys, and it was always delightful to see what they would bring. And so that's the story on my mom. Now, she met my father in around 1935, and I think it had something to do with my father's membership in a club called the Turners. All German men grew up being active in gymnasiums, and the gymnasium would play soccer and basketball and handball and your classic Olympic exercises, and they would compete on city and state level. And both my father, Uncle Tony, and my dad, Joseph, were very active in the Turners and very successful athletes. I just talked to Bob Scherfel this past week, and we reaffirmed the fact that both his dad, Tony, and my dad, Joseph, were active both level and at state level in their athletic events and had done very successfully their exercises like you see on the Olympics. My dad specialized in the horse, the pommel, and in the bars. My Uncle Tony specialized in the parallel bars, particularly, and you've seen all of those events on the net in the Olympics. But my father won several awards at state level for his work on the rings. And if you've seen an athlete who works on the rings, you know that you never really want to upset somebody with that kind of upper body strength. Enough said.
So you said that maybe Oma and your dad met?
Probably at the Turners, because they used to have these big picnics in northern Ohio, out at a lake someplace. And they would be big social events with big dancing halls, outdoor dancing halls, with the German band and the Oompa and everything, and drinking beer and doing these athletic events. And so that was a big deal, and I'm pretty sure that Dad and Mom met at such a place because both he and she speak High German. And both she and he did not have good opinions of people that spoke Low German. So you could tell what kind of crowd they would hang around with. And by the way, there were a lot of German-speaking immigrant people in Cleveland. Big community. I think the only larger community at the time that my father and mother were courting were the Italians and the Polish. What else?
So about Mom, after they met, they got married, and then...
They got married around 1937. I was born in 38. And the story there is that when she was pregnant, they rented a house in what's called Brooklyn, neighborhood of Cleveland, which is not to be mixed up with the little town of Brooklyn, which is right next door. It's a neighborhood on the west side, southwest side of Cleveland, and it was a pretty new neighborhood. A lot of people were moving into it, and they had an upstairs on a two-story house, and I have nice pictures of me in the gardening in the backyard and sprinkling the flowers, and I'm as cute as can be, and Mom is as pretty as can be. It was nice pictures. And then Joe came. When they found out that Joe was coming on the way, they decided to buy a house, brand new house, in Parma, Ohio, which was a community that just blooming at this time. And so we ended up on 4406 Albert Lee Avenue in Parma, Ohio. And by the time we moved in, and Joe was an infant at that place, and one day my father was taking pictures of us, I think it was an Easter morning, and we were on the front porch, and he's telling us to smile at the camera, and I'm holding Joe up because he hasn't learned to walk yet. And he decides he wants the camera, and he takes the first step of his life on film.
Oh.
My father caught the first step of Uncle Joe on film in the front of our house in Parma, Ohio. Now, that's a nice memory because we still have that picture.
Yeah, no, that's great.
But back then, a nice house, brand new house, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, on about 1/8 of an acre of land. A lot of lawn in the front and a big backyard. My mother loved it because she loved to plant vegetables.
Yeah, I was going to ask
Because she
you
was
about her
being
garden.
raised on a farm, she didn't like city life. And when, at times, especially during World War II, when everybody was encouraged to have what was called a victory garden, we didn't have a backyard, we had a garden. And there was enough food being grown on that garden for the whole neighborhood. You plant it, she planted it, and it was successful, nourished, fertilized, pruned, without any artificial pesticides or herbicides or fertilizers. She was a great believer in recycling everything from the kitchen sink, went into the ground. And she had tomatoes like you wouldn't believe. In fact, she won several prizes for her tomatoes, sometimes as big as watermelons, as grapefruits, and 6 and 7 foot high tomato plants. But there wasn't anything she couldn't grow. Corn, cabbage, everything. And she just had that green thumb, always did all of her life. Peach trees, pear trees, everything. And in fact, our garden grew into the next yard and the next yard behind us too, because they were not built up, the lots were not built up yet. It just kept growing. Then when rationing, I should mention, James thought, nobody knows about rationing. World War II, you were limited how many eggs, how much milk, how much bread, how much gasoline, etc., tires, even whatever that the war effort needed. You had everybody in the American population was rationing per family. You had little cards, and every time you bought something, a hole was punched out on it, so know that you had taken your quota of eggs or milk for that particular trip to the store. And that was hard for any American to realize what it was like to have things like gasoline rationed. So you had a lot of carpooling, and there were a lot of cars parked on jacks with tires ready to blow through their tires. Perfectly good car, but no rubber on the rims. Cracked old tires. Now, those are difficult days. Oh, another point. No toys. All the toy manufacturers were busy building war materials. The Lionel Train Company was making triggers for sea mines. To give you an idea of what we're talking about. Almost anybody that manufactured anything was making something for the Air Force, Navy, or the Army. Or shipping.
Different types.
Shipping,
sure.
build ships. Yeah. And everybody was overemployed too. 9-hour days, 10-hour days were common. I was going to make a little correction on what I said about Mom. The family name of the family that she worked for in Cleveland and raised their children was the Habers, or Haber. And Mr. Haber was not a doctor, maybe his wife was, but he was a vice president for the New York Central Railroad, which had headquarters in the Cleveland Terminal Tower. And so he was a big shot, and she worked for them between 1931 and 1935 or 36. And she raised the daughter, who then married a gentleman from Cleveland, and they moved to Brazil, and he opened a steel mill and became a political personality in Brazil. That's interesting. Now, the reason that Mom may have gone back to Germany in the mid-30s may have been because she had no papers and she had to get some background information. I believe she was engaged to my father because I remember her talking about how she had spent 30 or 40 days in Bavaria, and she spent a night or two at every one of my dad's tante's house in Bavaria. Some places at the bottom of ski slopes, other times at the backyard going into a nice blue water lake, and all of these things that you just dream about. And I've even got pictures up in that bookcase over there that were all the jewelry of those lakes in Bavaria. I've got the 1935 slide picture things, and they show the pictures. Anyway, that's why I knew all the Tante Dora, the Tante, I can't think of all their names right now, but they all ran these ski lodges on the southern edge of Switzerland and Germany. And one place they actually had where you could ski off the mountain right into your room. And never get on the street. Just anyway, lots of stories like that. And she met all of Dad's relatives, and apparently then she came home and she didn't have to get papers because she married my father, who is now a U.S. citizen. Ta-da! Maybe that cleared up all of that mess. I don't know. I'm not very clear on that. Uncle Joe's the one to go to on all the details of Mom's life.
So did Oma have any other relatives here in the United States? For her
Okay,
side of the family?
Mom had relatives from Sauerloch. What that means is second, third cousins, uncles, aunts. Not necessarily from the Bauer family, except I did know one Bauer family. And they were in St. Louis. And there was a tradition in Sauerloch where a young man would come to the United States and go to St. Louis, and they would apprentice at the Budweiser factory. And there was a whole clan of southern Hungarian Germans that lived in St. Louis, supported each other, traded houses, and all worked at the Budweiser factory in St. Louis. Now, I also knew there were some Sauerloch relatives with the name Bauer who lived in a poor neighborhood of Cincinnati, which I would go to visit for a free Sunday dinner when I was going to the University of Dayton, which was only 50 miles away. But we have lots of stories to talk about those kids.
And so they were somehow
They were
aunts or uncles or cousins?
They were like second cousins and first cousins from my mother from Sauerloch, but maybe a second generation Americans. So, I don't know their history very well. All I know is that they had very unusual nutrition. The drink at every meal, breakfast, lunch, and supper was Coke. And their teeth reflected the practice. You know, whether they were 21 or 16, they were missing teeth. And my auntie's favorite entertainment was the church bingo game. Don't know if she had a job. Interesting people, anyway. So, that's my background on my mother. I'll tell you another story about my mother. She loved Sunday drives because she was a country girl. She did not like living in the city. So we always went on country drives, and we couldn't resist stopping to buy produce at the roadside stands all over northern Ohio. So we really ate good apples, good fresh corn, good lettuce, good cabbage. Anything that would grow in Ohio would end up in our basket on the way home. And she loved cooking that stuff.
So when you were a kid, you went to church in the mornings then on Sunday?
Went to church and took a Sunday drive out to the country. Sometimes as far down as St. Mary's, Ohio, and buy everything in sight. Nuts and walnuts and everything. And hand-sewn scarves and wonderful stuff would be for sale. Honey, licorice, everything that would be homemade candies, all for sale on little street stands out in the country in front of the farmer's house. Guaranteed fresh. That was fun. And she loved talking to them. They would talk about seed and soil and rotation crops. You could, the farmer and mother was coming out. And so we enjoyed that. But she never did learn to drive. She couldn't handle a standard shift. And Dad had a very broken car, It was a 1952 Kaiser. No, 1948 Kaiser with only first and third gear on the shift, on the steering column. Didn't have a second gear, and too expensive to fix. And he didn't have a problem with it.
Well, he was the only driver, right?
He was the only driver, right. And then we started talking about Dad's Mercury. Now that we're talking about cars, when I was in high school, Dad bought a Mercury. That put him in the upper middle class status. And he did, because he was a tool maker. So I drove the Mercury to school one day, middle of the winter, and I succeeded in totaling out Dad's car. In the parking lot, coming out of it, it was very slick. It was ice, freezing rain. Guy come the other way, made a sharp turn in the road. I saw him coming. I knew there was glass ice on the street. I drove off the road. I drove up a driveway. I drove across a tree lawn. I hit the front porch of the house, and then this guy plowed into me on the front lawn and demolished my dad's car. And my dad said it was my fault.
Were you in the driver's seat?
I was driving.
So it was probably going to be blamed on you anyways.
That was his pride and joy. I really felt sorry for him.
Oh. So what you talked about Oma's hobbies and the things that she enjoyed doing, gardening being one, but what else did she enjoy?
She liked playing canasta, and she was a part of a canasta club. They would meet once a month and giggle and tell stories and swap cards all night long. And Uncle Joe and I and Caroline would go hide someplace. And they would rotate between houses.
Okay.
But they had a good old time, I'll tell you.
So there were other ladies?
Other ladies, same age. And all from the church.
Oh.
And it was fun for them. But we used to see it on the calendar, canasta date. Okay, we would figure out what else we were going to do that day. But a neighbor across the street, a couple of other ladies, the kids across the street that we played with, their mother was one of the ladies. And but it was fun. But 2 or 3 card tables got put out, and I never learned how to play canasta, but Uncle Joe did. It's a complicated game.
I remember playing with her when I would stay up there visiting her. I think all of us, John and Susie and Mary and myself, all got taught how to play canasta.
You know more about it than I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for the holidays, we had 2 other families that we spent with. The other 2 families, one was my Uncle Tony and his wife, Joanne. That was my dad's brother, and they had 2 children. That was Robert and Darlene. And Darlene was within a month the same age that I was. And they lived in a suburb called Euclid, Ohio. And Uncle Tony was a wonderful wood craftsman. He was a cabinet maker by trade, not just a woodworker. He made fine furniture. He went to work for General Electric making consoles for television sets and the older preceding televisions, those highly expensive many-band radios with the big speakers on them that people would listen to during World War II to hear what was going on in the world. Well, he built those radios, and then when televisions came out, they made beautiful living room furniture with a TV set in it. And by that time, he was the foreman of the furniture factory at General Electric. So he had a well-paying, responsible job. What I really admired was in the basement of his house in Euclid, he had his own personal wood shop. And every piece of equipment except his drill press, he had made out of wood, out of hardwood. The table saw, the joiner, the key cutting machines, all were made out of hardwood. The frame, the base, the table, all tongue and groove joints, wonderful craftsmanship. All made, and I always wondered what happened to that stuff. Because my cousin Bob was not interested in woodworking.
Oh no.
But even in this house, we still have bookcases that he made that are in the lighthouse room. That bookcase was made by Uncle Tony. It was given to me by Uncle Tony as a Christmas present. And Uncle Joe still had the big, huge bookcase that Uncle Tony made for his bedroom in Olmsted Falls. I don't know if he moved that to his new apartment in Cleveland or not. But those things were made by Uncle Tony. And back then, women were all housewives, unless you got a defense plant job. And they lived in Euclid, which was on the shore of Lake Erie, and which meant if we go there in the summer, we could swim in Lake Erie. Everybody on the street had beach privileges. And so that was fun. And I just talked to Bob Sharfield this week, and he called up, and we compared some notes about family and everything. And he had just been in Cleveland, and he sent us pictures of himself and his wife and Uncle Joe. And I'll show James the pictures.
Okay, great. Let's end it there.
Okay, you want to look at those pictures? Okay, the following comes from an interview I had with my older brother Matt, probably about 10 years ago, '07. And a couple bits of information about Oma, her hometown, and whatnot. Oma's mother's name is Catherine Mergel, M-E-R-G-E-L. So that introduces us to a whole nother family in Souderlock. Her family name was Bauer, and her father's name was Francisco, or whatever it was in that dialect. Frank Bauer. And I want to mention just a few things about him. Maybe it'll be duplicated here. When the Serbians invaded the part of Hungary that Souderlock is in, at the request of Bonaparte, Father Frank was drafted into the service. Now, Father Frank only had two skills. He was a farmer and a musician. So they put him in the band. However, the Hungarian army was defeated and captured by the Serbians, and Father Frank spent the next 2 years of his life in a prison of war camp, which was a place where everyone was undernourished and very sick. When he was released, he came home undernourished, bent over, and ill. He couldn't work. And he earned only a few dollars by his music, and then he died of premature age. Don't know the story. But that's the story about him. Now, I'm not too sure exactly what instruments he played, but he was supposed to have been the town musician. There wasn't a celebration that passed that he didn't participate in. Another thing Frank was telling me about the houses in Souderlock. The houses in Souderlock were similar to homes here in the Southwest. They were made with tamped earth. They would build a form and put sod and soil, dampen it into a mush or a dry mush, semi-dry mush, and force it down in the form and tamp on it with their feet. And then it would set, and they would do another layer. And I know people in the area of Ana, New Mexico, that still build homes that way. They're called tramped earth or stamped earth. Then they would use, for the roofing, would be thatching. And that's where you grow long stem plants of some kind, reeds, and you bundle them, and you've seen that in like English cottages and what have you. But in Eastern Europe all over, they would use these roofs. And Frank told me that there would be a group of men in town that would go around so that about every 7 to 10 years each house would receive a new roof done by this team of volunteers. They were all healthy young men. They would collect the reeds, bind them, and then they would, over a weekend, 10 of these guys would go to work and re-roof a house. So that kind of, if you know old historic buildings, you know you're still pretty primitive. And as time went by, they got wooden windows with glass in them. Before that, they just had windows with stretched, tanned hides for windows. The light would come through, but nothing else. Later on, they would put a layer of fixed brick on the outside, hardened fired brick on the outside to make the house resist the weather more. And you see down here in the Southwest, we plaster the outside of the adobe house to make the walls last longer. The number one reason for death in the villages was illness at an earlier age, and bad crops and starvation. It was very hard work, but you got to enjoy the fruits of your labor, especially if you had 2 good year harvests in a row, especially. The products that he mentioned that they grew, number one was wheat, corn, fodder, vegetables, potatoes, vine products, such as things that grow on a vine, either on the ground or like grapes. And I remember him putting up a whole trellis full of grapes on his house in Parma. The trellis, plums, nut trees, fruit trees, and then they would have their cash crops, which were tobacco and the drug opiums. They would have cisterns to save the rain off the roof, and their plants, the animals that they raised were pigs, cows, and chickens. And all of the hard work was done by draft horses. And I have a picture, Joe has a picture of Mom at about age 3 riding on the broad back of a draft horse. Her legs are crossed on her lap on the back of a draft horse, huge horse. And they said that when Father Franz came home from the war, he couldn't even lead a draft horse. He was all crippled up. He didn't have enough strength to override the direction the draft horse wanted to go through. And these were obedient animals. Okay, the population of Suderlock at its highest was about 500 homes. It's interesting. And they had celebrated their 200th year in 1937 with a big celebration. And he remembers that because he was there. He still lived there until 83, I believe, 1983. Joe has a picture of the church out of which Matt got arrested. And it was something about John the Baptist on June 24th, Johannes Baptista, big celebration every year. Lots of doctors and priests came from this town. It was compared to other towns, this town had a lot of advanced education people, very bright people. Professors, priests, and doctors. The French were responsible for the Serbian invasion of 1918, and they occupied the area which included 1 million German ethnic people. That whole part of southern Hungary had 1 million German ethnic people. And this was done, these 1 million German ethnic people were established in southern Austria by Maria Theresa, the Empress of Austria. And they did that to separate them from the Turks, who owned all the property up through Bulgaria and southern Romania. So they were right on the door. And they were very aggressive people. And all of the schooling was done through the church. And, whoa, a lot more on here. That had good, rich black soil. In 1971, Matt and Molly came to the United States. At that time, Frank was 20 and Kathy was 18. They came in November 23rd, and Matt had served 5 years in Russia in forced labor and 5 years in the Ukraine. Molly served 5 years of forced labor in Romania, reclaiming bricks. Frank went into the salt mines in Russia and then worked on army trucks in the Ukraine, Russian army trucks. In January 45, the Russian forces came through Hungary, and they retook the Ukraine, and they forced Frank by train into forced labor, and only the Germans were pulled out, the German-speaking people. In 1946, they began to form the collective farms. The collective farms were such where the women lived in one barracks, the men lived in another barracks, and the children were in a separate barracks. No families. And this is what they did to all the Germans and then all the Romanians.
And that's under communism?
Under communism, the collective farm. Frank said that productivity, if you measure 100% was as good as the Germans were doing it, it dropped to 35% immediately, the yield. He said by the time they gave up the collective farms, they were to 15% of the yield that the Germans could get off the same land. And this is with even powered tractors, not draft animals. Then the Russians and the Romanians realized that everybody in Romania was starving to death. And so they gave each of the German families a small plot of land next to their home or very near to their home. Oh, by the way, the homes in Romania were not in the fields, they were in towns. And you had to walk 5-10 miles to get to the farm fields. Not like America, where every farmhouse is on their own property. They lived for protection in the towns because the gypsies and the enemies came through all the time. So they had to live in little townlets for protection. When the little farms were established by Mother Teresa, each family was given 32 acres of land, which they would inherit if they worked it for 10 years. Most of these people eventually came to the United States. Continuing with the notes from Matt Pusklevitz. Matt was born in 1926 in Soderdock. Everybody in the area spoke the Black Forest dialect. I'm just going through his notes. The same dialect is spoken in Switzerland and in Austria. The family came down the Blue Danube on rafts to Soderdock. It took them 2 generations to clear the land of all of the jungle growth and badlands and swamplands that it had reverted to due to the Ottomans. When Mom came to the United States, she was employed at St. Ignatius Church in Cleveland, Ohio on the west side, which was a German parish. In the late 1920s, she fled to America to hide from her husband, who was searching for her all over Europe because she had run away and left her boy with Grandma. He searched for her and even came to the United States looking for her in St. Louis. She thought that's where she went. My name, William, is inherited because of my uncle, who was Grandma Victoria's brother, who died in World War I. So I'm named after Wilhelm, who died in World War I. and he was Grandma's brother. So now I know.
So he was a Wilhelm Bauer?
Wilhelm Scherfel. Victoria was a Scherfel. Married into the Scherfel family. So he was Wilhelm Scherfel, or Scharfel, as some people say it, and he died in World War I, probably in trench warfare. So now I know something about myself. So, the most important thing is that if you're doing hereditary check, is that Katrina Mergel was my great-grandma. My grandma. Katrina Mergel. My mom was Katrina and Bauer. And her dad was Franz Bauer. Okay, so Franz married Katrina Mergel. So we know a few Mergels. I've lost track of all of them. So, what else, James? We corrected the Havers thing. We got the ship that she passed over in 1930. And this was an interview that I'd had with Mom on April 2909 in Cleveland. My mom can speak several foreign languages, and she's self-taught. Slovenian, Croatian, Romanian, Hungarian, and German, not to mention English. History sponsor, St. Ignatius Church, we talked about that. She had a friend, when she came to the United States, she had a friend from Sutterlock that came with her. And they came over on the Bremer lines. They were cook for the priest. She had to return to Germany in 1935 before marrying her husband Joseph. And she had spent time with all of his relatives. She had a family in St. Louis that was called Bauer. And I remember Molly Jo because she was my age. When we would go to St. Louis on a train, and I would get train sick, we would visit the Bauer in St. Louis, and I always remembered that my cousin, Molly Jo, was stronger and bigger than I was, even though she was my age, and she could always pin me on the ground. And I was so angry. Anyway, she eventually went on to grow up to be 6'2" and won the contest for Miss 6 Foot in America, a beauty contest. And her husband was 6'4", and they both belonged to this over 6 foot club. And she won the national beauty contest. She was a beautiful girl and very strong. And they lived in St. Louis, and that family was from Sutterlock. And his father and her uncle worked at the Budweiser plant, which we then promptly toured, and my father sampled all the goods. And this all happened before the Prohibition. 1920s. So he went back to Hungary and bought a farm because he had a lot of money. Then he had relatives in Cincinnati. I can't remember their family name. They had 6 kids, and all they did was play bingo and drink Cokes. That's what I have on here. These people were Mom's great aunt and my great aunt's daughters. So that's a note there. It brings back much history. How much time we got?
A couple more minutes.
Okay, notes on 3/15/09. Continued. Molly's grandmom is Katerina, and her father was, I don't have the name. Mom's dad is Franz. He died in 1934 at 56 years of age of pneumonia. Suddenly, he had been in good health, but when he came back from the war, he played the trumpet. He was a trumpet player. Well, he played well at all weddings and other occasions in town. And these things happened usually in the spring and the fall. They were too busy in the summer. He had also worked in the U.S. in St. Louis. I didn't know that. In 1908, but he returned, and he returned to, what year we don't know, to Hungary. Mom had 2 brothers prior to her birth, and both died very young. That's why we always say Mom was the only boy on the farm.
So Oma's
Had 2 brothers older than
Oma's dad, which would be your grandpa.
Grandpa died of pneumonia
But he came to the United States?
in the 20s and worked at Budweiser factory
And then he went back.
and bought a farm.
Back over
Yeah.
in...
Because now he had the money to buy the farm, not just work on a farm. You see?
So, and he was a Bauer.
Yep.
So Frank Bauer,
Franz
Bauer, came to the United States
in the
worked
20s.
for a while, and then he went back.
That's right. That's what they all did from Sutter Lock. They all went to St. Louis, saved some money, and went back and bought the farms. She returned to Sutter Lock, but her daughter, Mom's mom, had a sister in Cincinnati. There you go. But she returned to Sutter Lock, but her daughter remained in Cincinnati. She had 9 children. I visited her kids for dinner in Cincinnati in 1962 from the University of Dayton. Mom had many relatives in the U.S. during the 1870s to the 1900s, including her grandmother, Frye. Now that's another family name to remember, the Frye family, F-R-Y. There are relatives in this country with the Frye name from the 1900s. In St. Louis.
The 1800s?
1880, 1890,
So those would have
1900.
been like Oma's aunts and
It would be from
uncles?
Oma's grandmother's side of the family, F-R-Y. I remember her talking about the Fries.
Oh,
Molly, that's Frank's wife, Molly. Her father's name was Frank Mueller, M-U-umlaut-L-E-R. He was born in 1891. This is for the record. His mother was Eva Sharp, or Schalp. She was born in 1893. Both were born in Sutter Lock. They were married February 10th, 1950. And Frank was born in Frank Jr., who now lives in Esthofen, Germany, was born September 12, 1952. That's your cousin Frank's. Rosie, he married Rosie, and she's also from Sutter Lock, but she moved over to Germany, and they were childhood sweethearts. But they married in West Germany. They married in 1970. They had one son, Christian by name. He was born in 1979. He has a degree in computer science, a doctorate degree in computer science in Germany. And he is a researcher at the university in Hamburg? No. One of those universities on the Rhine River. Presently research in the university in computer chip development. When I wrote this, Rosie is a lab technician in the local hospital. She owns the X-ray machine and the heart monitoring machines, and is just retired now. Matt's family got out of Romania, Sutter Lock, on December 10th, 1970, on their 3rd try to bribe themselves out of the Iron Curtain. This is an important date. Uncle Joe had to bribe a lot of people to get him out, and a special act in the House of Congress to get them to enter the country legally. They had to leave without any possessions. This was all happening because of the Iron Curtain in Europe. That's important.
and so he got out in 1970, it says?
December 10th, 1970, he came to the United States. All 4 of them came over with what they had in their pockets.
Wow.
He said they got a horse cart ride out of Sutter Lock. They got a 747 ride from Munich to New York. He said, they just did a time warp. He looked around, he said, this is what it means to live in the West?
And so those are all notes from your Uncle Matt. I mean, your brother Matt, your half-brother Matt.
My half-brother Matt and